Okay, well, welcome back to another session of our plant identification series. So today we are going to be covering the shape of the base and also the shape of the apex. So this is kind of a continuation from last week where we described the shape of the leaf overall. But remember, in that previous video we ignored the shape of the base and the apex. So that's what we're going to be going into today. So first of all, the two main things, or the two main pieces of terminology to keep in mind, is whether the apex or the base is acute or obtuse. And this is referring to the angle of the point. So if you remember back to school with geometry class, you would know that the right angle is 90 degrees, and anything less than 90 degrees is acute, and anything more than 90 degrees is obtuse. So what we can say about that here is that the apex of this Cuprosma macrocarpa is acute. It's got an acute apex because it is less than 90 degrees here. And the base is a little bit broader, but it is still less than 90 degrees, so the base here is also acute. Those are the two pieces of terminology to take away from this video. If you don't take away anything else, acute and also obtuse, which we don't see here, but I will try and find some examples for you that are obtuse as well. But yeah, let's get into some other pieces of terminology, because those aren't the only ways to describe an acute, or to describe an apex or a base. So for example, we have here an invasive Syzygium species, so it's okay if I rip off a leaf or two. So we look at that, it's definitely still an acute apex. You can see that it still is less than 90 degrees, so it's still definitely acute, but we can describe this a little bit more. We can see that it actually kind of tapers out to a point, rather than just kind of a straight line into that corner. It tapers out a little bit longer. It kind of elongates that apex, and that's what we call it Acuminate. Kind of looks like a bit of a drip tip. It allows the water to flow down and drip off the tips of the leaves, and that's Acuminate. We'll see the same characteristic on our hangi here, Geniostoma ligastrifolium. Got that same Acuminate apex. Now, this is where we're going to see an obtuse shape here. So on our hangi here, you can see that the base of the hangi leaf is broader than 90 degrees. So that is what we call an obtuse base and an acuminate apex. And just to introduce you to one or two extra pieces of terminology, sometimes if you look very closely at the very apex of a leaf, you may notice some other little characteristics about it. So this leaf as a whole, this is Cuprosma lucida. As a whole, this leaf would be categorized as an obtuse leaf. You can see that it's much wider than 90 degrees. But we can look right down at the very tip here, and you see we've got a sharp little point sticking out of the tip. And that can be a very diagnostic characteristic for some species, is noticing whether it has this little point here. And this point is what we call Cuspidate. So we've got a Cuspidate point on the end of Cuprosma lucida. A lot of other similar looking Cuprosma species do not have this Cuspidate tip, and that can be one way to tell that you're looking at lucida and not something else. For example, the Cuprosma macrocarpa that we were looking at before does not have that sharp little tip right at the end of it. Okay, so we've got another apex here to introduce you to. This is Cuprosma arborea, and you can see that at the very, very top of that apex we have, it kind of notches inwards a little bit, and this is what we call retuse. So retuse is kind of a little bit of an inward notch at the end of the leaf. Now there are a few different pieces of terminology for an inward notch. When it's a very kind of subtle tiny notch like this, that is retuse. If it's a little bit deeper, we may call it emarginate, or if it results in the entire leaf looking like a heart, then we would refer to it as being obcordate. You may want to watch back to that leaf shape video for a little bit more on cordate and obcordate. But yeah, so here we've got a tiny little notch at the end of the leaf that is retuse. And additionally, at the base of this, you can see that the lamina actually continues down the petiole itself. And this is what we call spathulate. So that's another base terminology for you as well. So we've got two new ones on this coprosma. We've got a retuse apex and a spathulate base. Now, not every single leaf on this has that retuse margin to it, so that is a bit of a variable characteristic with this species. For example, this one here, that's an obtuse base. Alright, so in the previous video I did introduce you to the cordate leaf shape, which is a heart-shaped leaf. Now, kind of the confusing thing about describing leaf shapes is that sometimes pieces of terminology can apply to the entire leaf, or you can apply it to a certain part of the leaf. So in the previous video I told you that Piper excelsum here has cordate shaped leaves, but you can also say that it just has a cordate leaf base, because it's the same bit that we're describing. We can say that the base is cordate on this, or we can say that the leaf is cordate. And then on the tip here, we could again say that it is shortly acuminate, because you can see it does kind of taper out to that point. So Kawakawa Piper excelsum, it's got a shortly acuminate apex and a cordate base. Well, there you have it. So that is essentially leaf shapes covered. Next up we're going to be getting into leaf margins, of which we need to learn how to be able to describe this monstrosity over here. This is Brachyglottis repunda. But if we're ignoring the margin and just trying to describe the shape, we should now be able to do so. So you can see already at the base we have a cordate base. I know it's not heart-shaped, but it has that notch to where the petiole attaches, and remember that is cordate. So we've got a cordate base, and we've got an acute apex. Well, that one actually looks almost obtuse, that one. So remember, some species do have a bit of variation when it comes to their actual shape. Sometimes they'll be acute to obtuse, meaning that it can be one or the other. Okay, just jumping in after the fact while I have been editing this video, and I realized I didn't quite say everything that I wanted to in my outro. First thing is I want to mention that I did not cover every single different type of leaf apex or leaf base, because again, just like I said in the previous video, there's just too many different little pieces of terminology out there, and I don't want to overwhelm you with all of them. So I'm going to give you the same piece of advice, which is that you should use Google Images and just search the words leaf base or leaf apex, and you will easily find heaps of really helpful diagrams online. One other piece of terminology that I just want to mention briefly, it was one that you probably will come across quite often. You may remember that I mentioned the acuminate apex that we had here on our syzygium, and also on the hangi, wherever that was, here. So hangi and the syzygium had an acuminate apex. If we have this long tapering point on the base, so let's just jump back to our Coprosma macrocarpa here. You can see we do have a bit of a tapering base to it. So I mentioned that we had kind of an acute apex, but we can describe this a little bit more, that it kind of has that same shape as our acuminate apex. But for a base, we do not call it acuminate. So this is not an acuminate base, it is an attenuate base. So just keep that in mind. If it kind of tapers out at the base, that is attenuate. If it's at the apex, it is acuminate. Now, this does bring into question one other piece of terminology. We talked about spathulate, which is essentially just a really extreme version of attenuate. So we've got that tapering out at the base, but it just keeps on going all the way down the petiole right to the stem itself. So spathulate is kind of just an extreme version of attenuate. Anyways, that's all that I wanted to cover. Main thing is just give it a Google if you're not sure how to describe a particular apex or base, and you should find plenty of diagrams on Google Images. Hopefully that's been helpful, and thank you for watching all the way to the end of this video. Please consider subscribing if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next one. All right, bye-bye.